All right, everybody. So today we're introducing post-colonial literary theory. This will be the final literary theory lens that we're introducing in English 3. Next semester in English 4, you'll be introduced to a few others. Know that as we read things fall apart, though, we'll still be falling back to what we've learned about Jungian or archetypal literary theory, as well as feminist literary theory. We'll also be looking at narrative structure. So that's a type of formalist literary theory. Formalism is looking at the way a text is structured. And we'll always be considering the history of a text as well, which is new historicist literary theory. But post-colonial literary theory is it's something a little bit different that I think maybe you've considered in the past, or maybe you've learned about elements of post-colonial literary theory, if you've learned about the scramble for Africa in other classes, or if you've learned about imperialism or countries that have been colonized. But I'm not sure how often you folks would have spent time thinking about that from a literary perspective. Um, so let's talk a little bit about what this literary theory really entitles or includes. Um, so what is it? Is our first question. It's a literary theory that grapples with and considers the legacy of 18th and 20th century European colonial rule, particularly. But it especially thinks about the dilemma of developing a national identity in the wake of a colonial rule. So now I know this isn't all of you, but for those of you who read Born a Crime, think about how for Trevor Noah, for most of his life, or most of his early life, he was living under a system of apartheid, a system of colonial rule that was ruled by the British. The South Africans had very little say in anything, in government, in life itself, right? It's just the fact that he was born a crime because the people in charge said that interracial marriages were illegal. Well, suddenly that system was abolished, right? Nelson Mandela becomes president. South Africans are given power, but then what? All of a sudden, he and other South Africans were trying to develop this national identity that they'd never had before, that many had never had before. So post-colonial literary theory looks at that. What happens when a colonial power is abolished, or when that colonial power gives up their power and the indigenous population is given their right again to rule? How does one suddenly develop a national identity when previously it has been stripped from them intentionally? How can you just give birth to a identity? That's something that's considered within this literary theory. Much of the literary theory is concerned with the lingering forms of colonial authority after the formal end of rule. So that speaks to this idea that once a colonizer gives up power, they still have some authority. They haven't, generally speaking, there's a lot of racism or power misbalance that's included in some of these um, colonial experiences, and that just doesn't go away overnight. So you'll see some of that with, again, I'll reference Born a Crime, that when apartheid fell, there was still racism. There were still plenty of people living in South Africa who were white who felt that they were superior to the blacks because for their whole lives or for many years, that's what they were told. The government said that white South Africans have more power, um, more privilege than people of color. And that just doesn't go away because a colonial authority or because there has been an end to rule of authority. And while I'll reference Born a Crime, this transcends that. There's been hundreds, countless, thousands of countries in the last several hundred years that have been colonized by other powers. And I'll try to reference some more of those too. Post-colonial literary theory is also concerned with the ways in which colonized people have served the interests of colonizers. And it raises questions about how the knowledge of subordinate people is produced. So let's break that down, that third bullet point down a bit. So when we're reading a text and we're looking at it through a post-colonial literary theory lens, first of all, we'll always want to consider, when someone is colonized, what were they asked to do? What were they asked to give up in order to be, as they were under rule of an authority figure? Were they asked to live a certain way? Were they asked to forget their pasts? Were they asked to forsake their beliefs and their traditions? You'll find that in Things Fall Apart, when we get into the missionaries coming into Africa, you'll find that slowly but surely these Africans are told that their way of living is wrong. They were told that they needed to change their ways because they were acting like savages, because they were angering a god that they had no understanding of. So that's something that a post-colonial literary theorist would look at and be concerned about, is what do these colonizers have to do? Or what do these colonizers rather ask the colonized people to do? And how do they ask them to change? The second part of this, raising questions about how knowledge of subordinate people is produced. What is a subordinate person? Does anybody in the house know? Either you don't know or you don't want your voice recorded, and that's okay. Um, Generally, I mean, that's someone who is under someone else's power. So it's asking questions about how, when we're reading a text, maybe it's a historical text, for instance, who writes the history books? Generally, it's the people in power. So when we read certain texts and we're learning about maybe the indigenous populations of a place, we have to wonder, how accurate is it? The knowledge that we learn of those who are under someone else's power many times is written by the person in power. So there can be issues with that. That's why Chinua Achebe's text is so important. It's because he really gave birth to this narrative of a colonized person, someone who was, he gave voice to the colonized. Any questions on those first couple bullet points? All right, we're going to keep pushing forward then. Now, there's different assumptions of post-colonialist theory. These are just different beliefs, if you will, of the post-colonial theorists. They would say that the past and the present of a colonized person is interwoven. That if you are someone who has been colonized, your past of being colonized defines your present. And in many ways, it defines your future, what you are able to do in the future. Now, some would argue, and some have argued, that look, you were colonized for a while, and that was an atrocity, we'll admit it, but you got to forget the past, right? It's over now. You've been given power again. You can live life as you wish. You got to forget the past. A post-colonial theorist would say that you can't. That if you deny the past, if you suppress what has happened in the past, you will sacrifice parts of yourself. That we are, as people, products of our past. That we are products of our past, and that denying or suppressing our past leads to a denial of our true self. So you'll need to try to consider that as we read this text and as we look at additional texts throughout this unit of those who have been colonized. Now, there's a concern with the struggles that occur when one culture is dominated by another culture. A historian by the name of Bressler stated that to be colonized is to be removed from history. To be colonized is to be removed from history. In its interaction with the conquering culture, the colonized or indigenous culture is forced to go underground or to be obliterated, to be destroyed. Essentially saying that when an indigenous culture is suddenly colonized, they are given three options. They can obey the colonizer. They can, if given this option, they can attempt to change themselves, right? Or they can go away, either by death or by going underground, having to hide. But this second bullet point reiterates the notion that the winners of history, or the powerful, those who have power, social power, economic power, political power, they are the ones who write history, and they are the ones who will have a voice in history, and they will remove the powerless from existence, from the textbooks, from the decision making, and so on. And it's only after the end of colonization, and only after the colonized people have had time to think about and process their period of colonization, that's the only time that post-colonial theory is able to come into existence. When these colonized can write about their oppression, and they can consider and write about the loss of cultural identity that took place. In a nutshell, post-colonial theory, folks, is about that. It's about people who have experienced oppression, people who have experienced the loss of their own cultural identity, and then people who have had the chance and the opportunity to think about it, process it, and write about it and share their experiences honestly and openly. Because otherwise, we can't trust any other perspective. We cannot trust fully the perspective of a colonizer to give us an accurate depiction of what happened. We really need multiple perspectives. And one of those would be that of the colonized. Does that kind of make sense? Doing okay so far? All right. We're going to keep pushing forward. Some additional assumptions of post-colonial theorists. And there are some important terms here that you'll definitely want to highlight or bold or star. Now, one of the founders of post-colonial theory, a gentleman by the name of Edward Said, and Edward Said wrote a book in 1978 called Orientalism, and it really helped to shape post-colonialist theory. And Said argued this when he was looking at all of the imperialism that had occurred throughout the 19th century. He tried to consider why. Why was this happening? Why did mankind, or why did these Europeans seem to believe that they had the right to colonize other countries, to go into another nation and claim it as their own, abolish the pre-existing cultures? What gave them the right? And he argued that many 19th century Europeans justified their conquests. They found them to be justified because of a belief that was being spread, and the belief was called, or he called, Orientalism. And these are racist stereotypes used to dehumanize indigenous peoples. You'll want to know that definition. Orientalism. Racist stereotypes used to dehumanize indigenous peoples. So that would be something along the lines of saying that, oh, this group of people, they're savages, they're godless, they're violent, they're all criminals, they'll murder their own brother if they have to, they're godless. They're all racist stereotypes without any facts or accuracy to ground them, but they were intentionally spread to justify these conquests. Now, initially, this Orientalism was spread and targeted people and cultures of Asia and in the Middle East. That's where some of this early colonial spread occurred. But later, it spread into Africa, looking at these African tribes and African cultures. And racist stereotypes made these people, in the eyes of Europeans, seem as though they were worthy of being conquered, that it was justified in the eyes of God and in the eyes of a quote unquote savage human being. Or not a savage, that these savages were held the right to be colonized because these Europeans were humane and they were superior to them. The basic thought behind the colonizer is this, Said said, that they are not like us at all, at all. And for that reason, they deserve to be ruled by us because we are superior. We are following the right path. Now, a post-colonial scholar, Homi Bhabha, suggested that the individual who has been colonized really suffers from some psychological damage in the process. That this individual permanently is left with two different, totally distinct views of the world. That they look at the world from the view of the colonizer, of the conqueror, and then they look at the world from their own view of the colonized, he or she who has been conquered. So that anyone who has been colonized forever has this dual identity, or it's also called a double consciousness, that they view the world as a conqueror and as a conquered. They view everything in life as one who takes, and they view everything in the world as that of the perspective of things that have been taken from them. Bhabha argues that this identity leads to double consciousness, and perhaps even more importantly, it leads to a sense of abandonment in the colonized person, that this psychological damage leads to a loss of personal identity, and that this damage is long lasting, that it can last for generations, that the children of the colonized and the grandchildren and the great grandchildren of the colonized can actually be born with or be taught this double consciousness, and that they too view the world and life itself from these two lenses, that of the conqueror and the conquered. They lack their own identity. So this section, folks, is going to discuss some of the different ideas and concepts that post-colonial literary theory explores. One of the overarching concepts is power. Who has power? in a post-colonial world and why. So these are some things you'll want to take down. Post-colonial literary theory will explore the idea of tensions. Tensions between the colonized and the colonizer. So in Things Fall Apart, I would ask, and this is something it's not on the doc, but I would ask that you make a note, a mental note or a written note or a type note, things to look for in Things Fall Apart. Tensions between the colonized and the colonizer. Look to Okonkwo and his tribe and the tensions that occur as these missionaries come in and start attempting to, at first, peacefully coexist with them, but then after a while, that peaceful gets thrown out the window and just try to coexist with them. Look for the tensions that occur between Okonkwo, his tribe, and the missionaries. The perpetuation of images and rhetoric of the colonized as inferior. Oftentimes, this is done through propaganda. And I know you folks, or I'm assuming you folks have learned about or studied various types of propaganda that have occurred throughout history. We'll see some of that in Things Fall Apart, but we'll see more of that in some of the supplemental docs that we explore. But in what ways is propaganda used? Think of Orientalism, or in other capacities. How are images and how is media and how are words used to try to exploit indigenous populations as inferior and as savage and as worthy of being conquered? You want to pay close attention, or a post-colonial literary theorist would pay close attention to resistance of being colonized. How does this occur? Is it peaceful? Does it become violent? When does it occur? Is it an initial resistance where a group comes in and the indigenous peoples fight back immediately and are beaten and then they're colonized? Or does the colonization happen kind of slowly and gradually, and then there's a sudden moment where the colonized decide enough's enough and they resist and they fight back mid colonization? Or is it something that happens consistently throughout the colonization period? Bullet point 4 is really important here. The concept of otherness, or the act of being othered. We'll refer to that notion of being othered often in both their identities and in their past or in their history. That's when a person is made to believe that they are outsiders, that they no longer belong in their own home or in their own culture. They're something else. They're something less than human. Certainly, we'll see notions of that in Born a Crime, where Trevor Noah is considered an outsider. He's considered an other, despite being a native to someone born in his own homeland. He's seen as someone that doesn't exist because of his, or that shouldn't exist because of his mixed race. We'll look at issues of power, and I would ask you to think back to some of the feminist literary theory that we've explored. They'll look at issues of economic power, political power, religious power, cultural power. Who has this power? What does this power entail? How did they get this power? Who has the power in a scene? Um, and how is this power? Are they aware of this power that they possess? And how is this power used against others? And they would look at the way colonized peoples respond to the colonial legacy by writing back to the center of investigating pre-colonial culture to find its true roots. And number 6 is at its heart centered around what Things Fall Apart does. We don't see the missionaries, we don't see the colonizers in Things Fall Apart until really halfway through the book. So we look at the life beforehand and how gradually the colonizers come in And by the end of the novel, they have a large presence, but at first, they're not even mentioned. So it's when indigenous people begin to write their own histories and their own legacy. And sometimes they use their own colonizers' language for their own purposes. But note that Achebe does explore and he investigates the pre-colonial culture to showcase more clearly what is lost as a result of this occupation. Post-colonial. I've got a chat. I don't know how to look at that chat. Oh, okay. How do we view history and who writes history and why? Um, so, folks, this portion of post-colonial theory would explore, number one, the idea, as we said before, that the powerful are the ones who record history. In this case, the colonizers are the ones who oftentimes are recording history in the history books, who are telling the stories, and they depict themselves as, you know, saviors in many cases. There's this justified perspective that we came in and we did God's will, or we did what we knew to be right because we are the advanced civilization. We are the good. They are the inferior. They are the evil. They are the godless. And that's a problem because bullet point two, there's this no. The truth is that the powerless and the colonized have valuable histories to share, but they're oftentimes not found in official documents or texts. So post-colonial theorists are interested in making those voiceless have a voice, in giving them the opportunity to share the true histories that have been suppressed by others. So they'll also look at, in bullet point three, the ways in which history and literature of the colonial powers is used to justify this colonialism, like we've said before. How have they used things like Orientalism to try to justify these conquests? Bullet point four discusses the ways in which literature and history of the colonial power is used to ignore historical stories and societies of the colonized. So, how do different stories or how do different histories that are told attempt to further the voicelessness of the colonized? I try to speed things up a little bit to ensure that we get through these by the end of the period. So, post-colonial theory will also explore how the colonized seek autonomous national identity in a post-colonial world and in the wake of the oppressor. How do they eventually get power when for years and maybe even generations, systems have been put into place that purposefully prevent them from obtaining power? They would explore the dilemma, the struggles of developing a national identity in the wake of colonial rule. It would look to the ways in which writers from colonized countries attempt to articulate and celebrate their cultural identities and, more importantly, to reclaim them from the colonizers. How do these colonized people who have suddenly been given power again, how do they reclaim their identities? Or in some cases, as they are being colonized, as they are still colonized, how do they attempt to preserve their identity, their cultural traditions? How is that done? When these people are told that their way of life is wrong, how do they still move forward and keep parts of themselves and their culture alive? Post-colonial literary theorists would also be interested in a notion or a concept called cultural hybridity. You'll want to know that term. And that refers to the mingling and integration of cultural signs and practices from both colonizing and colonized cultures. And that's something that happens, but generally only after a culture has been colonized for some times. You'll find that the colonized and the colonizers will sometimes integrate a little bit and create their own culture in and of itself. And that can be both beautiful in a way, the birth of a culture, but also problematic at looking at how a culture generally, if it's becoming hybrid, it means that a pre-existing culture has been forced to cease, has been eradicated, and it's been forced to evolve. Rarely does a hybrid occur without the death of another culture. It's change or be destroyed. Post-colonial literary theory will also explore the concepts of exile and alienation. It will look at the figurative, symbolic exile of the colonized when in their own land. So, a type of alienation that occurs, a type of search of self or the quest of self that occurs despite the oppression of the colonizers. You certainly see that in Things Fall Apart, this belief that these people suddenly feel as though they've been alienated from their own tribe or from their sense of reality due to this oppression. But it can also be a literal exile that occurs when they are brought to the land of the colonizer or when they choose to leave their homeland due to colonization. That won't be seen so much, that notion in Things Fall Apart, though if you explore any African American literature, especially right now in American lit, we're reading slave narratives and stories of slaves who were brought over to America. That would be an example of post-colonial lit theory's interest in the literal exile of the colonized and how they are making sense of what has happened when they've been forced to leave and brought to the land of the colonizer. And they would look at the alienation of the colonized, the state of not belonging, of not having a physical or psychological home, being literally homeless due to this oppression. Now, some of the questions that are posed by post-colonial theorists and questions that we will want to ask as we read this text and others is, how does the text explicitly or allegorically represent aspects of colonial oppression? So how does Things Fall Apart literally represent the colonial oppression, but how is it also in some ways within the story that it's told or in the story that's being told, how does it also reveal oppression through a story allegorically? Kind of a dual story, a story within a story. What does the text reveal about the problems of post-colonial identity? Looking at personal relationships and cultural identities and double consciousness and hybridity. How do we see those concepts within the text and what do they reveal about the problems of trying to develop a post-colonial identity? We'll want to ask, what persons or groups does Things Fall Apart identify as other? Who is othered? Who is considered the stranger in this text? And how are these persons and groups described and treated? And what does the text reveal about the politics or the psychology, the mind behind the anti-colonialist resistance? We'll see a lot of that through Okonkwo. He will be one of our greatest characters to give us this glimpse into the mind of the anti-colonialist resistance. A few more questions to pose. What does the text reveal about operations of cultural difference? In other words, in what ways are race and religion, our class, gender, sexual orientation, cultural beliefs, customs, in what ways are those combined to form an individual's identity? And how do those shape together? And how do they form perceptions of ourselves and others and the world in which we live? And then when you think of all of that, how are those stripped by an oppressor? How are those taken away? We'll want to look at the ways that Things Fall Apart and other texts respond or comment upon characters, themes, assumptions of a colonialist work. So, what do we make of the works of the colonizers? We still have to somehow read those and make sense of their perspective. Not that they are necessarily evil, but that their views are flawed, deeply flawed, um, and one-sided, and that they neglect an entire culture, a group of peoples, in order to convey their thoughts and words. And we'll want to think about, are there meaningful similarities found among the literature of different post-colonial populations? So when we look at those who have been colonized, are there similarities that can be found? When we look at Africans from and Nigerians from Things Fall Apart, and we look at the South African experience from Born a Crime, we look at Native American literature, the American Indians from here, from our own land, and what how they were occupied, and there was a cultural genocide that occurred. When we look at ourselves as Americans as being occupied by the British, when we look at South Koreans occupied by Japan, when we look at countless stories of the colonized and the colonizers, can we find some meaningful similarities in the literature that explores those tales, those histories? All right, folks. So, all right. So, guys, that will conclude this slide. If you have any questions about this, definitely do reach out.